When most people think of alcohol in China, they think of baijiu, a powerful distilled liquor made from sorghum. But as we meandered through the brewing recipes found in a Song Dynasty household manual, a question began to form. In an effort to understand Song Dynasty brewing, we decided to try our hand at a recipe from that household manual, the Shilin Guangji. Only after we started making this 1,000-year-old recipe for a rice-based brew did we land on our final research question. What would it take to recreate a 1,000-year-old brewing recipe? We got together one Sunday evening to see what we could do to answer that question. Along the way, we discovered some interesting things about brewing, about embodied knowledge, and the fascinating pitfalls that surround an attempt to recreate the past. The first step in the cooking process was a trip to the local Chinese market. The base material for our brew was sticky rice. The original recipe called for 16 pounds of it, but because our kitchen and our pots were small, we used a 5-pound bag instead. Then we found ginger and apricot kernels, a cousin of the almond, to use as raw material to make a yeast agent. When we got back to our teammate's apartment, the first thing we did was measure out and rinse our sticky rice. Because our rice cooker wasn't big enough to cook 5 pounds of sticky rice, we decided to use a pot and cook it on the stove instead. When the rice was completely cooked, we removed it from the pot and spread it in a pan to cool. After we emptied the rice out of the pot, we discovered a pleasant surprise: crunchy, delicious guoba. This is the rice that gets seared to the bottom of the pot during the cooking process. As we waited for our rice to cook, we stayed busy by putting together our flavoring and fermenting agent. The recipe instructed us to combine apricot kernels, ginger root, and a bit of flour to form a paste. After a bit of work, our raw materials yielded the consistency we were looking for. When our paste was completed, we rolled it into a thin sheet called a bing, or a cake, and placed it in the oven to dry and toast it. The combination of the toasting bing and the cooking rice filled the kitchen with a wonderful smell. When the bing was sufficiently toasted, we removed it from the oven and rolled it into a powder. That powder we then worked into our cooled sticky rice. After the powder was thoroughly incorporated into the rice, we put the mixture into a clay cooking pot and created a hole in the middle of the rice. As the brewing process progressed, alcoholic liquid would seep out of the rice and into the hole. That alcohol would be our final product. So, we sealed the cooking pot with cheesecloth and waited for our brew to brew. Then, after 5 days, we opened the pot and all shared in the delicious thing we created. Except that wasn't really how it turned out. When we opened our pot, we found a rice porridge covered with a film of pink mold. Gross. What happened? Where had we gone wrong? As we reflected on our attempt to recreate a recipe for an ancient Chinese brew, we stumbled on a few answers, a lot of questions, and a fair share of observations. Although recipes we selected are among the shortest and simplest in the Shilin Guangji, it is impossible to translate them into English without academic research or interpretation. Meanwhile, the language and writing style of our recipes suggests that their writer expected his readers to have some embodied knowledge about brewing alcohol. A major part of such embodied knowledge has been lost in the contemporary era. We'll talk more about that in a moment. Many educated guesses have been made in the process of translating something from a historical text. The very first problem of translating the recipes was how to convert measurements in the Song Dynasty into their modern counterparts. For example, dou, sheng, and liang are the most frequent measurements in the recipes. Although they were common in pre-modern China, the exact amounts of these measurements per unit were in fact different from one another, dynasty to dynasty. Many academic books in science, history, and sociology were consulted to find the closest approximations, which sometimes rendered the translated and converted amount into a complicated number like 2,278.5 grams. These complicated numbers made the reconstruction quite inconvenient for us here in 2017. The second problem was how to find English terms for specific objects. Many of the recipes contain more than one kind of yeast and have different names for them. In the recipe of Rooster's Crow Ale, 鸡鸣酒, jiao, and 麦捏 are also used. They are both yeast, but according to some academic research, the former is stronger and the latter is weaker. These terms are difficult to translate, so they had to be translated into descriptions like yeast and a weaker form of yeast. As translators, we did not have a clear idea about how exactly these two kinds of yeast were different. Apart from technical textual problems, we also noticed some interesting aspects of the recipes when translating them, which helped us better understand Shilin Guangji as a Song cooking manual. First, although it seems that the book is written in classical Chinese, after a close reading, we noticed that the recipes are written less in literary language, but more in vernacular expression. The writer was not highly literate, and he probably did not target well-educated readers either. One explanation for this phenomenon would be that most of the well-educated people in the Song Dynasty were not interested in writing about the process of cooking, although eating was another matter. Neither were they interested in reading cooking manuals, a written genre that served practical purposes rather than for study or entertainment. Although some Song literati scholars like Su Shi were famous for their interest in food and drink, the famous Confucian quote, "A gentleman always keeps away from the slaughterhouse and kitchen," 君子宴庖厨, from Mencius, was likely well known enough to keep most scholars away from cooking-related matters. The second interesting aspect of the recipes is that unlike modern cooking manuals that function as step-by-step instructions, the pre-modern recipes were like reminders for someone who already had some knowledge, specifically embodied knowledge, about alcohol production. Many descriptions in the recipes are unclear. The only thing we could do when reconstructing this recipe was to research, imagine, and make educated guesses. The first place we encountered the problem of accurate instructions was when we looked for ratios of ingredients. There weren't any. Even though, after consulting Song era weights and measures tables, we could get a pretty close estimate on the amount of sticky rice, 1 dou, about 16 3/4 pounds, the amount of ginger and apricot kernel, which we thought would act as a yeast agent, were not specifically listed. Two possibilities exist for the absence of ratios in this recipe. First, as with many Chinese cooking recipes, the range of amount could have been quite broad. Adjustments to ratio would result in adjustments to flavor, which is up to the cook, or brewer, to decide. Second, the approximate ratio may have been common sense knowledge for the recipe's intended audience. However, 1,000 years removed from the writing of this recipe, we guessed and moved on with the process. Another inevitable ambiguity is that the ingredients we use today are almost certainly different from raw ingredients available to Song-era cooks and brewers. Although ingredients still bear the same name, the object itself may have changed significantly. Take the ingredient Shilin, for example. In today's context, the word means almond, but in the Song, it actually meant apricot kernel. Almonds and apricot kernels are cousins, but not exactly the same, lending different flavors and aromas to the brew. Similarly, ingredient names may not have varied, but the species of that ingredient may have changed significantly. It can be argued that today's sticky rice is not exactly the same genetic strain used 1,000 years ago. These subtle differences make an exact replication of the Shilin Guangji recipe impossible. We can only attempt a reasonable facsimile. Apart from ratios, the tools used to process the ingredients and store the final product are not mentioned in the recipe either. Apparently, people of that time who brewed alcohol in their daily life must have been familiar with the tools they needed. For us, we had to choose tools available. In some cases, the kind of tools may not affect the production of the recipe. For example, instead of using a pot or pan to dry the ginger and apricot kernel cake, we used an oven. This method worked well and allowed us to avoid the messy and inexact task of tending a fire. In other cases, however, certain tools unavailable to us that were available in Song kitchens could be really practical. When we went to store the rice mixture at the very end of our brewing process, we were supposed to dig a hole in the center of the rice toward the bottom of the pot so that the exuded alcoholic liquid would accumulate in the hole. But we failed to shape that hole. This may have been because we did not let the rice cool properly, but large earthenware pots would have been helpful in this process as well. Shaping the rice may have been easier if specific tools existed to assist in this task as well. The issue of materials continued when we attempted to make our apricot kernel and ginger paste. To get the true sense of the material, we found that we had to get a feel for it with our hands. In other words, we could not simply put it in a blender and push the on button. Over the course of making the paste, we realized a fundamental difference between the recipes we had translated from the Shilin Guangji and those we are accustomed to using today. The present-day recipes we use provide step-by-step instructions, including detailed directions on how to accomplish prep tasks. Recipes are written this way because, for most of us, cooking is a task among other tasks. We did not grow up in the kitchen, in an environment where cooking and brewing, it seems, were all-day, everyday affairs. Compared to a present-day recipe, the Shilin Guangji recipes we attempted to reconstruct seemed filled with presumptive knowledge. Yes, it gave us a list of ingredients, and yes, it did give us some direction, but mostly it told us what the step of the process was supposed to look or feel like at the end of that step. We were left to discover the method and means of how to arrive at the finished product. So, we started with what we thought would be a time-saving tool, the blender. But, as you see in the video, we quickly abandoned the blender after a few ineffectual minutes. Next, we made a clumsy attempt at the mortar and pestle method, but soon switched methods again, putting the mixture in a plastic bag and trying to hammer it into submission. This method worked better than anything had up to that point, but when our bag broke, we ditched the technology of plastic and went wood on wood. We began to roll the mixture out with a rolling pin, which finally crushed the apricot kernels and gave us the consistency we wanted. In the end, we found that all of our time-saving ideas actually cost us quite a bit of time. And so, as we went from high-tech to lower-tech in our attempt to reach the desired result, we also went back in time to an age before electric kitchen contraptions and plastic bags. Brewers in pre-modern China were highly skilled technicians. As we discovered from our attempt to recreate a sticky rice brew from the Shilin Guangji, making Song-era dishes and beverages not only involved specialized tools and vessels, but a set of embodied knowledge tacit to those initiated in kitchen arts. This embodied knowledge was most likely transmitted locally, either through kinship relations or some sort of apprenticeship. Past scholarship dealt with the representation of food and drink in imperial China, passed over the production process and the skills necessary to create a successful result. Our project, however, attempted to pull knowledge off of the page and put it to use. Over the course of that process, we found that, like many other crafts, such as carpentry or blacksmithing, brewing in the Song Dynasty was a craft that required highly specialized tacit knowledge. The recipes we translated and used from the Shilin Guangji seemed to clearly exemplify Tim Ingold's definition of an artisan's handiwork. The recipe knew exactly what we should be making, but did not deem it necessary to tell us exactly what it was that we should do in order to reach the final product. To the craftsmen and craftswomen who composed the intended audience of such a text, elaboration on tools and methods was unnecessary, because it fell under the intellectual category of everyone knows that. This, then, is what we mean by embodied knowledge. It is a form of knowledge so firmly ingrained that even if someone asked you to describe what to do or how to do it, you couldn't. In other words, as knowledge was passed down through geographically bound lineage networks, either families or apprenticed trades, you would learn by doing, not by reading a manual. The body and the mind trained in such a fashion were the most critical tools available to the intended audience of the Shilin Guangji recipes. We seem to have proved this concept true due to our lack of this embodied knowledge. No one in our families brewed alcohol, and none of us had ever tried to brew anything before, even with a modern recipe. Our bodies and minds were shapeless, without experience. We assumed that because we could translate a recipe, we could therefore recreate it with relative ease. In order to reproduce these recipes most effectively, the brewer must have the correct ingredients, the right tools, the proper methods for handling and processing those ingredients, and the right embodied knowledge, which we lack. We do believe, however, that this new materiality is an interesting avenue to pursue in further research. After all, it is much more engaging to interact with texts when you have taken the time to interact with the stuff of the text with your own two hands.